Men are not less emotional. I know that sentence irritates people, particularly people who have spent their entire lives emotionally orbiting men to the point where they can no longer distinguish observation from attachment. But I was not raised inside that dependency structure. I grew up within a female-only community shaped by the philosophical teachings of the Divine Mother and the Orim'sa Tenosh tradition. Men were never centered within our emotional world. They were not treated as leaders of thought, emotional anchors, or psychological authorities. They existed mostly as external variables, occasionally present, occasionally useful, frequently unstable. And distance creates clarity. When you are not socialized to romanticize male behavior, patterns become difficult to ignore. One of the earliest patterns I noticed was this: men are not less emotional than women. In many cases, they appear significantly more emotionally reactive. What they often lack is not emotional capacity, but emotional regulation. Modern societies confuse emotional expression with emotional experience. That confusion contaminates almost every discussion around male psychology. When most people hear the word emotion, they imagine verbal vulnerability, crying, confession, emotional openness, softness, emotional vocabulary. Women are generally socialized toward those behaviors, so women become labeled more emotional. But emotion is not defined by presentation style. Emotion is biology before language ever arrives. Emotion is elevated pulse, adrenaline, shame response, fear response, territoriality, impulse, aggression, compulsion, status anxiety, emotional dysregulation. And once emotion is defined properly, the claim that men are somehow less emotional collapses almost immediately under observation. The women who raised me taught psychological discipline very early. Not suppression, discipline. Those are completely different things. Suppression is emotional denial. Discipline is emotional management. Suppression says, do not feel. Discipline says, you are responsible for what you do with what you feel. Modern societies overwhelmingly teach men suppression rather than regulation. Do not cry. Do not appear weak. Do not appear vulnerable. Do not appear uncertain. Do not appear afraid. And because those emotional states are forbidden rather than processed, they accumulate internally. Pressure without release, emotion without language, pain without reflection, fear without vulnerability. Then, eventually, something seemingly insignificant occurs: a rejection, an embarrassment, a challenge to status, a woman saying no, a public correction, a perceived disrespect, and suddenly the eruption arrives. People then describe the behavior as overreacting, but most of the time you are not witnessing overreaction. You are witnessing emotional backlog detonating all at once. The explosion did not begin in that moment. That moment was simply the fracture point. I think this is one of the great failures of modern psychology. It spends so much time protecting male self-image that it often refuses to describe male emotionality honestly. Many men are emotionally overwhelmed constantly. They simply externalize emotion differently. Women are generally trained to process emotion linguistically. Men are generally trained to process emotion behaviorally. So instead of saying, I feel humiliated, many men become aggressive. Instead of saying, I feel rejected, they become controlling. Instead of saying, I feel inadequate, they become obsessed with dominance. Instead of saying, I feel emotionally unsafe, they withdraw entirely. But these are still emotional reactions. The behavior changes. The emotion does not disappear. One thing that struck me repeatedly during the brief interactions I had with men throughout my life was how emotionally fragile many of them seemed, despite constantly presenting themselves as emotionally durable. The atmosphere around them often felt unstable, not always violently unstable, but psychologically unstable, as though enormous amounts of emotional energy were being held together through force rather than integration. One perceived insult could alter the entire atmosphere. One challenge to competence. One moment of embarrassment. One implication of weakness. And suddenly posture changed, tone changed, movement changed. Tension entered the environment instantly. Again, that is not emotional absence. That is emotional volatility. Modern society often mistakes silence for emotional control. Those are not equivalent. Silence can be regulation, but silence can also be suppression. And suppression eventually leaks, usually through anger. This is why anger becomes the dominant emotional language for so many men. Because anger is permitted, fear is humiliating, sadness is feminized, vulnerability is punished, insecurity is weakness. But anger? Anger remains socially acceptable masculine expression in many cultures. So every emotional state eventually gets dragged toward aggression, because aggression preserves masculine status. A man crying publicly creates discomfort. A man raging publicly is often excused. He's stressed. He's passionate. He just lost control. Notice the inversion. Vulnerability is treated as shameful. Dysregulation is treated as natural. And then societies wonder why male violence rates remain catastrophically high across nearly every civilization on Earth. Men commit the overwhelming majority of violent crime. That is not ideology. That is statistical reality. And most violence is emotionally impulsive. Rage, humiliation, jealousy, possessiveness, territoriality, status competition, emotional dysregulation. Human civilization keeps describing male violence as though it emerges from cold rationality, when much of it is profoundly emotional. A man murders another man over disrespect. A man assaults his partner over jealousy. A man destroys his own life over wounded pride. A man crashes his vehicle in a rage because another driver challenged his status for 6 seconds in traffic. These are emotional behaviors, extremely emotional behaviors. But because they do not resemble feminine emotional expression, societies misclassify them as something else. That misclassification has done immense damage. One of the central teachings within the Orim'sa Tenosh philosophy is that emotional regulation is a developmental responsibility. Not a personality trait, a responsibility, a skill. It requires self-awareness, pattern recognition, impulse control, discomfort tolerance, reflection, delayed reaction, internal honesty. Most people are not naturally born emotionally regulated. They learn it, or fail to, and many men are never properly taught. Instead, they are taught avoidance, suppression, performance, stoicism without emotional literacy, dominance without self-awareness. Then societies act surprised when emotionally underdeveloped men occupy positions involving political power, military power, domestic power, physical power, economic power, and institutional authority. An emotionally dysregulated creature with physical authority becomes socially dangerous very quickly. This is one reason female communities often prioritize emotional discipline intensely, because emotional instability destabilizes entire social systems. And no, this is not man-hatred. I find that accusation intellectually lazy. Observation is not hatred. Pattern recognition is not hatred. If I say unstable bridges collapse more frequently, I am not expressing hatred toward bridges. I am describing structural weakness. Many societies already understand that male emotional instability is real. They simply refuse to speak about it honestly. You can see this in how men regulate one another socially. Men shame each other constantly for weakness, for cowardice, for emotional exposure, for incompetence, for failure, for lack of control. Get a grip, man up, stop embarrassing yourself, sort yourself out. That is shame-based regulation. It already exists. The issue is not whether shame should exist. The issue is what behaviors societies choose to shame. Currently, many cultures shame male vulnerability more harshly than male emotional incompetence. That is backwards. A man openly crying after emotional devastation is often treated as socially uncomfortable. A man punching walls, threatening people, screaming aggressively, becoming possessive, or behaving erratically is often treated as expected masculine behavior. Expected, normalized, excused. That is a catastrophic inversion of values. Men should not be shamed for emotional honesty. They should be shamed for emotional incompetence. Those are completely different things. A psychologically mature adult should be expected to regulate themselves. particularly when their bodies possess the capacity for immense physical harm. One thing modern discourse consistently misunderstands is that many men do not primarily regulate themselves through empathy. They regulate themselves through status. This makes many people uncomfortable because modern societies romanticize male psychology constantly. But observe men honestly. A man may ignore compassionate advice for years, then change his behavior overnight after a single humiliating social moment. Why? Because embarrassment affects status, and status heavily governs male behavior. This is visible everywhere. Male peer groups, sports culture, military structures, street violence, corporate hierarchy, political rhetoric. Masculine identity is often tied deeply to external perception. How other men view them matters enormously, sometimes more than morality itself. And this is precisely why shame remains an effective behavioral force among men, whether modern society wishes to admit it or not. Again, the question is not whether shame exists. The question is what societies attach shame to. Right now, many societies attach shame to softness while excusing instability. That creates emotionally constipated men with no healthy relationship to vulnerability and extremely poor impulse regulation. Then the entire civilization absorbs the consequences. Women absorb the consequences domestically. Children absorb the consequences developmentally. Communities absorb the consequences socially. And governments absorb the consequences institutionally. One of the strangest things about modern discourse is that people will acknowledge male violence statistically while refusing to acknowledge the emotional instability driving much of it. It is treated as though male violence emerges from some detached rational calculation. But much of it is reactive, impulsive, emotionally charged. Men are not less emotional than women. Many are simply less emotionally literate. There is a difference. A person can feel intensely while understanding themselves very poorly. In fact, that combination often creates the most dangerous psychological outcomes. The inability to identify emotion does not eliminate emotion. It simply removes conscious mediation. And unconscious emotion is often far more destructive. Within the teachings I was raised around, adulthood was never measured purely by age. Adulthood was measured by containment. Can you experience humiliation without becoming cruel? Can you experience rejection without becoming possessive? Can you experience insecurity without becoming controlling? Can you experience fear without demanding domination? Can you experience anger without surrendering to violence? That is maturity, not emotional numbness, not suppression, not performance, control, consciousness, self-governance. Many modern societies raise men to fear emotional awareness itself, which means many men spend their entire lives emotionally ruled by forces they cannot even name properly. And what humanity calls masculinity often appears, from my perspective, to be a highly ritualized system for disguising emotional vulnerability beneath dominance behavior. That disguise fools many people, but not all of us. Not those raised outside the emotional gravity field surrounding male social conditioning. Distance clarifies structure, and from a distance the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Men are not less emotional than women. They are often more emotionally reactive, less emotionally trained, and socially rewarded for disguising dysregulation as strength, and pretending otherwise has already failed at civilizational scale.